Good morning, everyone, and thank you again for joining us this morning for the first part of a two-part morning enrichment experience. This morning, we're going to be looking at the experience of COVID-19 through the lens of transition and grief. And then next week, we'll come together again on Saturday and building upon some of the things we talked about this week, put a spiritual lens or a spiritual filter over that as we consider our current experience around the virus and everything that's happening to us. As we proceed this morning, our time together will be in three parts. The first part, I'll be sharing about 10 slides with you. It'll probably go maybe close to 40 minutes. And after that, we'll have an opportunity to take some time for some personal prayer and reflection around a few questions that I hope will help unpack some of your recent experience. And then finally, the final part of our time together, we'll have some time to connect with one another in small groups. So that is the plan. Let us move to our first slide here. So much has been changing in our lives over the last 7-8 weeks. And I think it's true to say that most of us, for the most part, embrace change, welcome change. Certainly a change of season with the weather finally getting warmer will certainly be very welcome. But transition is another story. And as this slide indicates, there are really two types of transitions in our lives. And although every transition involves change, not every change is a transition, and that'll become very clear momentarily. But as we think about the transitions of our lives, they fall into two camps. There's developmental and there are situational transitions. These developmental transitions, we pretty much all have in common. They are predictable, they are scheduled. Examples include graduating high school and striking out on our own with our first job and really trying to build an independent life for ourselves. Perhaps getting married, having a family, losing our parents, coming into an empty nest if we were parents, retiring are all examples of developmental transitions. These are also often thought of as life stages or milestones. We move from young adult to middle age to senior adult. In 2 years, I am going to be turning 60. And although 11,000 people in our country, roughly, turn 60 every day, it will be the first time I ever turn 60. So for the very first time, I will be, I guess, in the old age or in the youth of old age, as they say. And so even though we all experience these developmental transitions, when we personally come to them, we are experiencing them for the first time, which makes all the difference. Then there are situational transitions. Again, these are dependent on our life circumstances and what's happening. And so much of what's happening now in response to COVID is situational. These transitions tend to be unanticipated. They often come at the worst time. Examples can include things that have been happening to us, many of us right now, losing our job, getting sick, losing a loved one. These situational transitions often are accompanied by developmental transitions. So it may be the case that we are going through multiple transitions at the same time. And that's not one change we're trying to deal with. But the reason that we tend to resist transition is because all transitions revolve or involve a breakdown of our current stable life situation. Transitions, as this diagram from Bill Bridges that was put together by a mentor of mine, Jim Zullo, indicates, take place in really three phases. Transitions begin with an ending. Something comes to an end in our life. And again, there's so many endings and losses that are being experienced by all of us these days. And the more attached we are to what has ended, the more profound our grieving is going to be, and the more protracted our grieving is going to be. So these endings tend to shake up our identity, and they create a crisis of meaning for us, because what happens is our anchors are taken away from us. Those roles and relationships that have grounded us when our life was more stable have come to an end. And so people in transition often say things like, I'm just not myself lately, or I'm beside myself. Isn't that a wonderful image? I'm beside myself. I used to be this guy over here, but I know I'm not him, and I'm not quite sure who I am. So if transitions begin with an ending, they end with a new beginning. But then that brings a certain level of anxiety, because we don't know what that new beginning necessarily is going to be all about. And we certainly, in these days, are quite unsure about where the future after COVID is headed. We're not sure we're going to like it. So as we think about the transition experience, they begin with an ending, they end with a new beginning, but definitely the most difficult part of the journey is what is in between, what Bill Bridges refers to as the neutral zone, and Murray Stein calls liminality, liminal space. Liminal means threshold. So we have left one room and we have yet to enter the next room. We are betwixt and between, you might say. And in that experience of liminal space, we certainly feel lost. We feel disconnected from what was. There's a vulnerability because things, again, that have anchored us have passed away. So we just assume skip this part. We just like to move right to the beginning if we could. Thank you very much. During this time of liminal space, disillusionment is the common experience. We feel like we've been set up. Everything that we've invested our life in has now somehow been taken away. Everything that I thought was once real feels transparent. It's kind of lost its gravitas. Anxiety or fear is common here. We're just more on edge, more fearful. Depression is often an experience we have, not necessarily clinical depression, but just a loss of energy. Just about the only thing we can do is maybe binge on Netflix or just take a lot of naps. It's just sometimes very tough to get off the couch. When I was 40 years old, I went through a whopper of a transition. I had left my full-time work at Old St. Pat's to do something different. And that something different was not materializing in the way I had planned or hoped. And then my dad died. And shortly after my dad died, I fell out of my attic into the garage and required back surgery. And then 2 weeks after my back surgery, I got the chicken pox. And when you're 40 years old and you get the chicken pox, it's not a pleasant experience. So I had a health trigger, I had a relationships trigger, and I had a work trigger that led me into a deep, deep liminal journey that lasted 8, 9, 10 months. And during that time, really, I certainly tried to kind of keep up the appearances and show up where I was needed. But really, for the most part, all I was good for was playing catch with my 7-year-old son and taking long walks in the neighborhood after my family went to bed each night. So I share that with you because the crisis that transition precipitates in our life can really blister our spirit. It can leave us groping in so many ways. But here's what I want to suggest to you. That the voices occupying this space of liminality are not simply voices of pain, although they are certainly present, but they're also voices of creativity here. There are voices of opportunity, and generally we don't see the creativity and the growth while we're in the throes of the liminal space because of all the pain we're encountering. But once we've moved through it and we can look in the rearview mirror, that's when we see what was happening. That's how we see how new life was beginning to emerge. And friends, liminal space is necessary. It's a necessary part of our growth and development as individuals, and it's a necessary part of our growth and development as a species as well. And this time of liminal space can be equated to a farmer leaving the field fallow. You know, if you're not a farmer and you look out at the field, you might say to yourself, geez, nothing's happening out there. But the farmer knows better. The farmer knows that the soil is breaking down. The soil is regenerating itself. The soil is preparing to grow new life again. And this fallow time is so necessary for the continued health of the crops, if you will. We in the Christian tradition have an image for this fallow time. I guess maybe you'd call it a creative emptiness. Another way to explain this experience of liminal space, and that creative emptiness is expressed beautifully in the image of the virgin birth. Right? It's the empty vessel that becomes impregnated by divine possibility. But in order for the vessel to become virginized, if you will, it has to be poured out of all that was in it. And that pouring out, that letting go, that is the painful experience within liminal space. But it's necessary, because only once it's poured out can something new be poured in. But this really takes time. And in the words of the late Tom Petty, the waiting is the hardest part. The problem is it's awfully hard for us to wait, because we live in a culture where the assumption is if you're waiting, well, hey, you're doing nothing. You're basically just wasting your time. But here's the advice the Buddha gives us. The Buddha says, don't just do something, stand there. Don't just do something, stand there. And because of the pandemic, many of us are forced to be doing a lot of standing in place these days. And when we are waiting, standing in place, perhaps what we are doing, friends, is the most important something there is. And that is allowing our souls to grow up in a way that they wouldn't had it not been for the liminal space. Transitions and this experience of transition is probably best expressed in the natural world, right? There's no renewal in all of nature without some preceding loss. There is no spring without winter. We know that better than anyone living here in Chicago, where the winters are so dark and cold and hard and lifeless. But we move through that, and we need to move through that in order to get to a new spring and a new summer. And so as we move through transition, there is a constant temptation, once the old world has broken up, and that is to stay in security, to hold ourselves together in some way, rather than moving out in some new direction, right? We want to try to put it back together the way it was. There's a gospel story about the man who wants to follow Jesus. And he says, Jesus, I'm going to be right with you. But first, I'm going to have to go bury my father. And Jesus gives him what seems to be a pretty harsh answer. He says, follow me and leave the dead to bury the dead. On the spiritual level, this, my friends, is the call to separation, to leave the dead, to leave what's no longer giving life. And we have to, in order to do that, let go of the old, right? In order to be able to finally pick up the new. And as you know as well as I do, it's awfully hard to let go of the old. Here's another configuration of our experience of transition. The horizontal axis is time. We move from past to future. And the vertical axis is you. Below the horizontal axis, there is your inner life, your internal self, and above it is your outer world. And so when transitions begin with an ending, they often begin right in the top left quadrant there. Something comes to an end in our external life. And the first experience is usually denial, like, I can't believe this is happening to me. And out of that denial comes inner resistance. We just don't want this. We're pushing it away. We're resisting it with every turn. But finally, something begins to shift in our inner life. And that resistance leads to exploration. We begin to imagine what might be possible. Is there anything else I might be doing here, could be doing here? And so often through that time of liminal space, we move back and forth from resistance to exploration until we finally can embrace a new commitment, embrace some new life that begins to emerge. And I would suggest to you that we know that we've made it successfully through a transition, not only when we're able to let go of the old, but when we can allow it to bless us as well. You know, I know a number of people who used to be with Arthur Anderson, and they have now all been rehired and are leading quite successful lives. But some of them look back at their time with Anderson and what happened, and they say, you know, although it was very difficult, they don't deny any of the pain, it seemed to be necessary. They claimed it as part of their story. It got them to where they are now. Where other people look back at that time and they're still bitter, right? Their life has not changed internally. It's only really changed externally. And again, how we deal with these losses are so very significant in what happens to us during a time of transition. Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day is a book you may have read to your kids or may have read to yourself. Judith Forst is well known for her children's literature. And the title certainly captures, and the picture captures a lot of perhaps what we're experiencing today. But Judith Forst was also a journalist, and she was a psychoanalyst researcher. And she has a really great one line that's very instructive for us. She says, our lives are determined, for better or for worse, by what we do with our losses. And I think, friends, that there are so many elderly people in our culture and so very few elders in our culture, principally because we don't have time for the pain, right? We're afraid of the pain of our emotions. And when our losses are not grieved, the grief and the loss becomes cumulative. And I think this is why when people get old, their life can get so very small and their relationships become very, very few. And even the few people that are in their life, sometimes they don't even like them all that much. And we can become fearful and have such little trust. Why? Because our lives are determined, for better or for worse, by what we do with our losses. And as we mentioned before, the more attached we are to what we have lost, to the endings that have happened in our lives, the more profound our grieving is going to be. And let's face it, in these last 5, 6, 7 weeks, our losses have been legion. There are just so many things, from loss of health to loss of loved ones to loss of security, loss of jobs, that we're dealing with. And some of us, perhaps many of us on this call, are experiencing probably more anticipatory losses and anticipatory grief. It's almost like when you get a diagnosis, a bad diagnosis, and you know that your life is never going to be the same again. It hasn't happened yet, but you're anticipating all the loss and all the change that's ahead of you. And this is the experience for many of us during this time. I don't think, friends, loss can be comparative. We just shouldn't do that. Although we certainly try. We try our best to compare our losses. Yesterday, I was out walking in the neighborhood, and I bumped into Kevin, who's a soon-to-be graduating high school senior. And we were talking, he was talking about all the rites of passage he's most likely going to miss here at the end of this very important time in his life. And later in the afternoon, I got an email, and I heard that Joe, who many of you probably know, is the longtime security guard at Old St. Pat's. His son Anthony had passed away just in this past November, and yesterday his other son, Joe Jr., had died at Loyola University Hospital of COVID-19. I bring him up, first of all, to ask that you might remember he and his family in your prayers, but also to recognize that as you think about these two losses of Kevin and Joe's, of course, our mind is going to be drawn to judge the severity of those losses. And at one level, they don't compare at all, absolutely at all. But here's what also is true about those losses. The worst loss is always the one that is personal. In other words, the worst loss is always the one that is happening to me. So comparing my loss to other people, I'm always going to be tempted in some way to discount my own loss. And as soon as I start doing that, my losses begin to build on one another. And in fact, when I was talking to Kevin yesterday, much of what he was saying was, I know this is a big deal, but really compared to what everybody else is going through, it's not so bad. Well, here's a grief counseling maxim, right? This is sort of a law of grief counseling. We can't heal what we don't feel. And whether we like it or not, friends, what we do with our losses determines what kind of people we will eventually become. So let's talk a little bit about understanding our grief. And so much of recent grief work has rested on the shoulders of Elisabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages of dying that she identified back in the 60s and early 70s. It's important for us to remember that these stages are descriptive. They just describe what is happening to us, either as we're moving through the dying process, or in this case, as we're moving through the grieving process. They are not prescriptive. In other words, we don't move through these stages in any particular order. They're not linear, right? Anytime we conceptualize our experience with our mind, which is helpful to help us understand our experience, but we always want to take it further by trying to create more order, right? And so we think, oh, we move from this stage to this stage to this stage. And what is true is that, yes, these are descriptive of the experience that we have, but what is also true is that loss and grief, well, there's always a healthy dose of mystery in the experience that we're just never going to explain. And this is what makes it personal for everyone who goes through it. So I'm giving you David Kessler's model of the 6 stages of loss here. David Kessler, if you don't know him, he's one of the world's foremost experts on loss and grief, and he adds the 6th stage of meaning to Kubler-Ross's model. And you know these, and we won't take time going through them, but what I'd really want to invite you to think about is how these stages may be descriptive of what is happening in your own life these last 5, 6, 7 weeks. Do you notice any of this in your experience? So perhaps there's some denial, right? That, hey, this virus isn't going to affect me, right? This is about other people. It's not about me. And, unfortunately, as we begin to see the pushback on some of these public demonstrations trying to reopen the economy, we can see there's a lot of denial in the world. And sometimes that is putting a lot of folks in harm's way, or at least making them far more susceptible to infection. There's anger, right? And that's part of what's driving, some of these protests. So don't make me stay at home. Don't take away my activities. I saw a sign at one of these protests. Don't take away my golf season. So that's legitimate as we go through our grieving to be angry for what have been taken away, what we have lost. There's bargaining, right? Okay, I'm going to social distance. I'll do it till the end of May. But then everything better be better, right? Right? It's going to be better after May, right? I'm only going to do this for so long. So we understand that bargaining as we move through this process, which also accompanies sadness or depression, right? And the more we realize how protracted this pandemic impact is, the easier it is to fall into a deeper sense of sadness, like I just don't know when this is going to end. There's also acceptance, right? That this is happening. I'm recognizing that this now is the reality of my life, right? Because it's the reality of my life, I've got to figure out how to proceed, right? So I'll get my masks and I'll do the things I need to socially distance, and I'm going to reach out to people who I know I need to stay in contact with, and I know it's important for me to have touch points with them so they can be in contact with others. So we try to do what we can to make our situation better and act constructively. And finally, there's meaning, right? And this is really very much to be determined. We'll see what happens. But meaning making really becomes the container with which we are able to hold our experience of loss and grief. And we'll talk more about this next week when we get into the spiritual dimension, because it's the way that many of us make meaning. It doesn't in any way take away the pain. It doesn't in any way exempt us from having to suffer through our grieving process. But it does give us a little bit of a cushion, and again, a container in which to hold and perhaps understand what's happening to us. Which leads us to ask the question, how might we respond to our grief? And the first thing I did is put it in a larger font and a bolder font, and that is to say that grief finds its own path. We have to remember that. This morning while I was having breakfast before the presentation to get a little inspiration, I was listening to a podcast where Brene Brown was interviewing David Kessler. And David had lost a son, and one of his sons had passed away. And Brene Brown asked him about the higher divorce rate of parents who lose a child. And David Kessler said something very insightful. He said, the divorce is not caused by the loss of the child, but by how differently the parents who have lost the child grieve that loss. And those differences eventually become irreconcilable, right? Again, our lives really are determined by what we do with our losses. And at this moment in time, we are dealing with the collective loss of the world that we used to know, right? We are grieving at the individual, societal, and world level. It's unprecedented, really, it is unprecedented. And in addition to all that suffering and pain, this moment, this experience also comes with the potential really to be an axial moment in the evolutionary journey of humanity. Because again, along with the pain, there is the opportunity, the creativity for us to move our human project forward in ways that perhaps we have yet to be able to do, or maybe even imagine. But as we move through the pain, it's going to be so very important to hold our humanity and our emotions with compassion, right? There's going to be sadness and tears and all sorts of feelings in the coming weeks and months. So the first step, perhaps, is just acknowledgement. We have to acknowledge what we're experiencing. You might say, okay, feeling, show yourself to me, right? And in the acknowledging process, we're not trying to fix the feeling. We're just trying to be present to it. You might even whisper to yourself what you're feeling. Name it: sadness, fear, anxiety, longing, whatever it might be. Try to hold that with some respect. And when we do, that allows the feeling to open. It may intensify for a bit, that's true, but it eventually will soften. And our feelings are very much like waves. They peak and then they settle. And if you grew up near a ocean or maybe at the lake and you learn to swim in the waves, you learn to ride the waves, you jump up as the wave came down, but you knew it would eventually bring you down back on solid ground. And this, again, is the experience of our feelings. So the first step is to acknowledge them. The second step is to bring a sense of compassion to ourselves and all the fears and confusion and really helplessness we're experiencing. These feelings that we're having, they're constructive. They actually serve a purpose. They're part of the fight, flight, freeze instinct that has been part of our species for, really millennia. So by gently naming the feeling we are experiencing, whether it's upset or worry or fear, whatever it might be, we can then perhaps put our hand over our heart and just take a couple breaths and say, thank you. Thank you, feeling, for trying to protect me. I'm okay. I'm okay now. This is going to be okay. To name our feelings, offer ourselves some loving kindness, allows us to reset our consciousness, right? It allows us to get regrounded. All the very best neuroscience on trauma and its release is based on this kind of caring attention, right, that we can bring to ourselves. Right? Compassion to touch the hurting places in our lives. But in order to do that, we first have to acknowledge the hurting places. Then we can bring compassion there. And we can further extend that compassion to others, from our next door neighbor to our state and federal leaders. We've never done a pandemic before. This is the first time. And so we're building the bridge as we walk on it. And mistakes are going to be made by all of us. There'll be plenty of days when my best self and your best self and the best self of our state and federal leaders don't show up to the party. The more we move, though, to judgment and away from compassion, the more separation we place between ourselves. And friends, as you well know, during this time, we need one another now more than ever. Since this is, in large part, what we're experiencing, anticipatory grief, anticipatory loss, it's going to be important for us to return to the present moment again and again and again. Really to live one day at a time as best we're able to. We can't live them all at once, nor should we try. And, in previous chapels, we talked about the 11th commandment of this time, to just be in the present moment. And I put the serenity prayer on this slide because I can't think of a better prayer for this moment in time, because there's so much here that we simply can't control, that is beyond our control. And all we can do is pray for the grace to accept what we cannot change. But there are also things that we can do, right? There are places in our life where constructive activity is possible. So to be able to have the courage to do the things that we can, right? This prayer is so important, I think, for what we're going through. Finally, the pandemic is both open-ended and temporary. It's open-ended. We don't know when it's going to end, which makes it all the more menacing, right? Makes it all the more problematic. But at the same time, we do know that it's temporary. And this pandemic, just reminding ourselves, is a temporary state. I think it's helpful to say that, right? History tells us that these events happen and that they are survivable, right? I think back to the Gloria Gaynor song, right? And she can be our cheerleader. We will survive, right? As long as we know how to love. Right? So this may be a time to overprotect, but it is certainly not a time to overreact. And I did leave you David Kessler's website, www.grief.com, which has so many great resources there. Finally, let's bring our all these comments to a close around perhaps the greatest transition story ever told, and homework assignment I might give you, as we probably are watching more TV than we normally do. Maybe you'd consider putting The Wizard of Oz in your queue. It's again, a great transition story. The story begins with the experience of Dorothy living in that one-room house in the Dust Bowl of Kansas, and it's dull and it's gray, and her life has been reduced to narrow roles and expectations, right? There's little room in her life for her deeper parts of herself to come out and breathe, and so there she is gazing over the rainbow. But then what happens? The cyclone comes, and Dorothy, standing there at her too small house and somewhere over the rainbow, is taken up by this cyclone. But notice the other dimensions of the story, right? Aunt Em runs out into the yard and throws open that trap door and crawls down into that dark hole in the security of her cellar and says, "Dorothy, come in here. Let's let the cyclone pass, and then we'll try to put our lives back together the way they will. You know, certainly the cow will be dead, half the chickens will be missing, but we'll try to put it back together again just the way it was." And again, this is that temptation for security, for what was, rather than moving out to what will be. Dorothy refuses that. And so what does she do? She rides the cyclone right into the heart of transformation. And as she gets taken up in the cyclone, as she sits in her house, I'm going to read you something from the book, The Wizard of Oz. Again, this is right after she gets picked up by the cyclone. "It was very dark, and the wind howled terribly around her. Hour after hour passed away, and slowly Dorothy got over her fright. At first she had wondered if she would be dashed to pieces when the house fell. But as the hours passed, she stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly and see what the future would bring." She stopped worrying and resolved to wait calmly to see what the future would bring. Hope, my friends, lies in braving the chaos and waiting calmly to see where life will take us next, right? Life has cared for us this far. We have to trust that it will continue to do so. Where does it take Dorothy? She has this terrific experience of liminality in the land of Oz, where she meets a scarecrow without her brain. Read that she learns how to think for herself during this time in ways that she never could without it. She meets a tin woodsman without a heart. She learns to experience her own feelings. And she meets a lion without courage. She discovers her own inner metal during this time of liminal space and transition. I think the same is going to be true for you and me. We're going to find people in our lives supporting us, maybe people who are not our normal support network, but they're going to be calling forth parts of you that you didn't realize were there. And you're very much going to be doing that for other people as well, because we are all in this together. So we are care recipients, and at the same time, we are caregivers. And like Dorothy, we just never know what we are going to discover about ourselves and what we're called to be and do in this world until we walk through this very treacherous liminal space. And as we walk through it, what happens to us? Well, we can look back again to Dorothy and all the questions that she had to deal with when she was in the land of Oz. Like, what is the power of these ruby slippers? How will I find my way to Oz? Is the wizard a good wizard? How will I ever get the broom back from the Wicked Witch of the West? And perhaps the most important question is, how do I get back home? And I bet you have questions that wake you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and won't let you go back to sleep. Questions that you can't answer, questions that have more a hold on you. But here's what I want to suggest, friends. Creativity does not exist in certainty. It never exists in certainty. It only exists in ambiguity. And we're breaking up, we're breaking down, we're breaking up. And because of that, we are breaking through to something new on our individual as well as our collective evolutionary journey. And perhaps the best thing we can do right now is just try to live in the questions that inhabit our dark night by dwelling creatively with them, by dwelling creatively with what is unresolved inside of us. And so that leads us to our prayerful pondering and a journal exercise that I hope you'll consider. We'll take a little time now, and I invite you to take a pen to paper. I know perhaps some of you may not be big journalers, but even if you just write some things down, as we put pen to paper, it just helps us clarify our experience, helps us clarify a little bit all the stuff that's swirling around within us. So I'm going to read these questions for you. And you're not going to be able to answer all of them in the space and time that we have, but pick one and spend some time with it. So we'll begin. Recall a significant transition from your own life's journey so far. What did you say goodbye to? And what did you let go of? What did you come to embrace? And what did you commit to? Between the ending and the beginning, what did you learn during that time of darkness, ambiguity, and liminal space? Perhaps what you learned may guide you today. Perhaps recalling that time may remind you of your own resilience and give you some confidence in your own inner resources. So go back to one transition in your own life and assess it again and see what it may have to offer you today. The second question is, which of the 5 stages of loss, denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance, have you been identifying most with lately? How have these been showing up? Again, maybe 1, 2, 3, or more of these have been showing up for you. And perhaps most importantly, how do you talk to yourself and treat yourself as you find yourself grieving your current losses and your anticipated losses? And the final question, friends, if transition is the process we experience that allows us to become all that we were created to be, both individually and collectively, right? How can you approach transition as a constructive friend rather than simply a destructive foe, right? And again, we're not trying to romanticize it in any way, shape, or form and discount the pain and the destruction that is a part of the process. But if our current experience has the potential to be partly constructive, friend, what might you do differently in the coming days and weeks? So again, friends, see which of these questions draws you in and allow yourself to prayerfully ponder them. And if you're so moved, put pen to paper. And we'll let the bell sound and we'll have about 12 minutes to, again, reflect on one of these questions.